Welcome back to the Christian Mysticism Podcast, where we explore the fascinating history of Christian mysticism from the early days of the Church until today. I'm Alberto de la Cruz, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Carlos Ayer, the T. Lawrence Riggs Professor of History and Religious Studies at Yale University. Good to have you on again, Carlos.
Yeah, it's great to be back. Always very good. I look forward to these sessions very much.
I do as well, and today's topic is an interesting one, and I have to say, and you know this as well, but our listeners may not be aware of it, we get a lot of emails on this specific topic, and I think it was a good idea that you brought this up and that we're doing it. So tell us today's topic.
Today's topic is mysticism and madness. What's the difference? And this is a topic that goes way back. It's always been part of not just the Christian mystical tradition, but all mystical traditions. Anyone who claims to enter or contact another dimension, they have to somehow prove that they're doing that. And in the meantime, before they prove anything or before they convince anyone, they're placed in the same category as either a fraud or just a crazy person, right? Because mental illness has been a part of human existence for, well, experts tell us it's millions of years, if not hundreds of thousands of years. The brain is as susceptible to disorders as any other part of the body. So, unfortunately, this tug and pull, right? It's a tug and pull or dialectic between mystical experience and madness.
I think it might be a good idea for us to define madness or insanity, however we want to call it. So we sort of have a reference point.
Sure. And the question is, are all mystical experiences some sort of insanity? Are they on the insanity spectrum? Is one way to ask the question. And that's a question that's been asked repeatedly since the mid-19th century especially. But it all depends on how one defines madness or insanity, as well as mysticism. But let's start with the easier one, which is mysticism. If you define it as crossing over into another realm of existence, in the case of Christian mysticism, of course, it's crossing over into the divine realm, the divine and spiritual, supernatural realm. And that's a huge claim to make. When it comes to madness or insanity, I think the broadest kind of definition that I would be using is abnormal behavior. And abnormal behavior that is accompanied by, in many cases, a crippling of normal relations between human beings. That is, between the person who is claiming to have these extraordinary experiences and other human beings. If somebody's hearing voices and seeing things that no one else sees, well, in many cases, as we have seen repeatedly in other podcasts, a lot of these mystics have to go through quite a bit of grilling to prove that their claims are legitimate. But I take a kind of a functionalist approach to defining mysticism as abnormal or anomalous experiences that most people don't have, that actually, in many ways, integrate you to the people around you, rather than erect barriers between you and those around you. And the bottom line, especially for us who live in the 21st century, bottom line about mystical experience is that it has a physiological dimension, and it can be located in the brain. Brain activity during prayer has been measured and mapped, numerous experiments. There was one, well, maybe this is like a decade or two ago, but a convent of Carmelite nuns, they were all wired up, their heads were wired up to see where they're praying, what part of their brain became active when they were praying. And that's only one of, I don't know the exact number of such experiments that have been carried out, but there have been many. And now neurologists are fairly sure that they know which regions of the brain are the ones in which religious experiences happen. And I find that remarkable, that there is this physiological aspect. But of course, one would have to expect that, because we human beings have bodies and organs inside our bodies that perform certain functions. So if you're going to cross into another dimension, what is the equipment? And that's what I find astonishing about most mystical traditions, is that this is the premise. The premise is that you make contact physically as well as spiritually. Crossing over to spirit involves some aspect of physicality. And you flip that coin around and you get to prayer, which is central to mysticism. Or in other traditions, non-Christian, it's meditation rather than prayer. But where do prayers go? I mean, like physically, if you're saying prayers out loud, obviously they're supposed to be, the whole premise is they're crossing over to the divine dimension. And if you're saying prayers silently, just inside your head, even more so, going straight from your brain to this other dimension. And the claim, the assumption is that there is a link between our brains and our tongues and the divine realm.
Now, I have heard argued by others, and I've read some people comparing mystical experiences or excusing or explaining mystical experiences as schizophrenia. You have a schizophrenic that hears voices in their head, voices telling them what to do. Right. And even some of these schizophrenics say, it's God talking to me, or it's an angel, or it's some heavenly body, or some demon, or something of that sort. How do you reconcile the obvious instances where you do have someone who is a schizophrenic and the similar experiences that a mystic has?
Well, back to something I said a few minutes ago, which is, if you view it from a functionalist approach, is what effect are those experiences having on this person? Is it creating problems for everyone around this person? Or is it sort of integrating this person ever more fully into the world around them? There are expressions such as, being a functional psychiatric patient. You're functional, you can perform in the world. Your mental illness does not get in your way. So mental illness is on a spectrum from completely debilitating, perhaps even dangerous and violent mental illness, and going down the spectrum to experiences that are integrative. They give this person not just a new sense of meaning of their existence, but some sense of purpose, and they become highly functional. As a matter of fact, in many cases, these individuals that have made it to the list of great saints and mystics, they have been extremely active, and that back and forth between contemplation and action. Many of the greatest mystics have managed to integrate those two very fully. And of course, if it's a mystic who is Christian, what they're going to talk about has to do with the Christian religion. Whereas at the other end of the spectrum, psychotic person is not talking really about, sometimes they might put it in religious terms, but they're not usually talking about their religion, not necessarily. It's the way that the experience gets integrated that, to me, is key distinction.
I think what really hits me from what you just explained is when you think of mystics such as Saint Teresa and Saint Francis and others who had these very intense experiences that some have tried to write off as being schizophrenic or psychotic, but these people went on to be not only functional, but achieve amazing things and build convents and build churches and bring people together and movements. And how many paranoid schizophrenics do we really know of that are able to be that functional, to be able to do so much if they have such a debilitating disease? So I think that's a very good point, where you really have to look at not just the experience, but what are the effects of that experience? Not so much to say that, hearing voices in your head that are Christian is good, hearing voices in your head that are non-Christian are bad. Not just that. I think the point is hearing voices in your head and going on to do incredible, wonderful, good things is a huge dividing line between hearing voices in your head and becoming unable to function in society, becoming a hermit, just, suffering serious mental illness. I think that's a very important distinction to make.
Yeah, it is. And, I'm not claiming credit for coming up with that distinction. One of the earliest psychologists, because the discipline of psychology didn't really exist till the 19th century. But one of the first was an American, William James, who taught at Harvard. And he wrote a book at the turn of the last century, so now, we're talking 120 some years ago, with the title Varieties of Religious Experience. And he was one of the very first psychologists, period, but he was also pioneering in one way in his study of religious experience to study mystics and to come up with a distinction between healthy and unhealthy mysticism. And this distinction has to do with the results of the mystical experiences. Unhealthy is madness or insanity. Healthy is a life shaped by extraordinary achievements. And Teresa of Avila was one of his prime examples. Very healthy mysticism. And of course, William James, as a scientist, was more accepting of the possible reality of the supernatural dimension than many of his scientific colleagues. And I think I might have brought him up before concerning another one of his terms, wild facts. The fact that human history is full of wild facts, of, weird, unexplainable events for which science has no explanation. And of course, the mystical claims made by mystics fall into that category of wild facts. And the physical phenomena of mysticism also fall into this category of wild fact. So James is very important in the study of mystical experience. Books usually don't last a century or more as a point of reference for many subjects. This is very unusual. His book still is a point of reference for analyzing mystical experience.
Now, another question we get fairly often, which I believe is in this sort of the same vein, can mystical experiences be triggered by some type of external stimulus, be it a traumatic event or drugs or any other thing that would kind of, in other words, bring about a mystical experience in an unnatural way?
Yeah, and I think that is an area where the line separating the religious experience from, let's say, brain injury, brain lesion, or some specific drug, that line can be very fuzzy at times, very clear where the line is. And what I always say in answer to that question specifically is that, yes, mystical experience always begins with some physiological change. In the case of Christian mysticism and Buddhist mysticism and Hindu mysticism, self-denial and constant prayer or meditation is the physiological doorway to mystical experience, to crossing over into the other realm. And to me, that is one of the most fascinating facts, that there is, global mysticism, not specific to one religion alone. There are many different kinds of mysticisms, as there are many different kinds of religions. But in almost every case that I know, especially in the major religious traditions, you do something to your body and your brain. Your body, you fast. You deny yourself pleasurable experiences, and you pray a lot. Not just a lot, but in some cases, your aim is to pray constantly, even as you're doing other tasks. So there's that aspect of it. And let's say that one can argue that religious mysticism and these major religious traditions, including Christianity, is inseparable from a certain lifestyle, as Americans like to say. And what is that lifestyle? What is the mystical lifestyle? Is self-denial. And self-denial is not only fasting, but denying yourself comforts of all sorts. You're trying to control and tame your body, focus your physical existence on things that are in another dimension, because that's what prayer does. It connects you with another dimension. Brain lesion, having a tumor and all of a sudden you're having visions and so on. Or as in my case, I had a serious brain injury 10 years ago, and I lost my sense of smell completely. But for the first year or year and a half, I also had olfactory hallucinations. It's a medical condition known as phantomia, where you actually smell things that are not there. The smell is in your brain. Everywhere I went, it smelled the same. It was that smell followed me everywhere. And I'll tell you, it felt very, very real. Very real. So the brain can produce these things. I always thought if you're having a hallucination, you can say, oh my God, this is a hallucination. But in my case, my smell, which kind of became less and less nasty, because at first it was nasty, it smelled like the hospital. And it finally went away. But I started to look at hallucinations and mystical experiences in a very different light, how real the brain can make something. But drugs, wow, drugs open up your mind to all sorts of hidden realities. And the thing is that they open your mind not just to hidden realities that are real, but it can also open your mind to hallucinations. So it's a bit of a gamble with mushrooms and LSD and other psychotropic drugs, where that takes you. But the lifestyle to which it is connected is not necessarily, and in most cases is not tied to religion. Although it can be, definitely. I've known people who consider themselves religious and their drug experience to be an enhancement of their religion. Is that madness, taking mushrooms, LSD, something else? That's where, again, we enter a very fuzzy area. But there is an instrument known as the God helmet. And this has been going on for almost 2 decades, I think, since neurologists have discovered where in the brain religious activity is centered. Well, they put electrodes with magnetic charge right over those spots. All right. And these are, sometimes they're inside a helmet. Sometimes it's just, you see the wires on people's heads. But a very, very high percentage of the subjects in these experiments who have had those areas of their brain stimulated claim to have religious or even mystical experiences. And all of this is undeniable. I mean, this is hard science. So what do we do with those experiences? Well, they're in a very fuzzy realm, aren't they? I'm trying to imagine if this God helmet were to be... actually, it is marketed online. Our listeners, you can go online, search for God helmet, and there, 2 years ago, I found some websites that were selling you God helmets. So I can just imagine a store like Verizon or AT&T selling God helmets to people. It might change the world for better, for all we know. There's a novel that came out several years ago about a nun who starts having mystical experiences, and then doctors discover that she has a brain tumor. And the premise of the story is that now she's forced to decide whether to have the tumor removed and lose all her mystical experiences, or just live with the tumor, have those mystical experiences, and eventually the tumor will kill her. What a storyline, but not very far removed from reality that such things can happen.
I remember years ago, I can't remember if it was 60 Minutes or one of those television magazines. But they had a man who's in his late 60s, very successful businessman, and he got early onset Alzheimer's. And he was a very left-brained individual, a very black and white guy, not creative or anything. But once he got the Alzheimer's, all of a sudden he began to paint. And he painted these incredible, beautiful paintings that were unbelievable, and never had any training, never painted before in his life, had never shown any artistic inclinations. But he was in a home he had gotten so bad, and they had given him these canvases and paints as, part of the activities of the people that were in this home with Alzheimer's. And he just started to paint these incredible things, and scientists were just trying to figure out what it was, and they were thinking there was something. Going back to we talked about trauma and parts of the brain being affected, that the Alzheimer's may have triggered something in the brain that activated that part on the right side of the brain for him to be more creative and more artistic.
Oh,
but
yeah.
Even in the same vein,
Yes.
You see individuals that, and I remember one, I actually saw a video of him the other day. I hadn't seen him for years, but it was just an old video. Severe mental retardation, born blind, and couldn't speak. And one day, I think he was like 10 or 12 years old, sat at a piano and just began playing Mozart and Bach and all these different incredible things and singing, which he had never spoken before. And you wonder how complex the brain is, where all these things are, all these wires and connections
Latent, yes.
And other things can kind of trigger what happens. It can sort of have a chain reaction. You lose one part, but it triggers another part. And I think the brain is just so complex and so much that we don't know about it, that it's really impossible to tell exactly what is triggering these things, at least with our current knowledge of brain physiology and how brains work.
Right. And some people with head injuries have very similar things happen to them. I did not. I just lost my sense of smell and had those hallucinations for a while. But there are people who have come out of brain injuries, like this man you just mentioned. All of a sudden, they've never been musically talented, and all of a sudden they have this great musical talent. Or they develop new abilities to deal with complicated math and so on and so forth. And it's a long list. And then there are people who, right after their head injury, suddenly start speaking whatever their language it was, that it's their native language, but they start speaking it with an accent.
I've
like
seen
a
those
Scottish
as well.
accent I'm talking about. Yeah. So I was hoping to come out of my head injury with a Scottish accent, but it didn't happen. Stuck with my Midwestern accent.
Well, it would have been fun to do this show with Sean Connery.
Yes, laddie. But, St. Teresa Avila being one of the prime examples of healthy mysticism to William James, the beginning of her mystical life is not simply explained because she suffered illness for a long time. She described herself as a lackadaisical nun, and we're not sure of how much self-denial she was involved in, but she certainly was involved in all the daily prayer of the convent. And when she came out roaring on both the supernatural aspect of mysticism as well as the very, very highly functional aspect. She became a dynamo, establishing, 17 convents, reforming her order, writing constantly. So this is why she falls under it, healthy. But the point I'm leading to with this, making mention of this, is that I've seen arguments that claim that the mere fact that we have identified that these experiences happen in the brain, as a place, as a locus, means that they're not spiritual, that there is actually nothing but a material phenomenon going on. And, I see why that's a logical argument to make, but it's also ignoring the fact that human beings going way, way back to the time when we lived in caves, have been having religious experiences. It's something related to our very being, to our being physical. And the Christian religion in particular, and Catholicism even more so, a lot of the religion is about being embodied. And, religious services, worship, rituals, they all, in one way or another, have to do with physicality. And although not every Christian church agrees with other Christian churches on the issue of the Eucharist, that one sacrament, for heaven's sakes, you ingest a piece of bread and drink wine that are, according to Catholic Church teaching, they are the body and blood of Jesus. You ingest Jesus. How weird is that? It's very physical. And somehow that gets you to that other realm. And the other sacraments, baptism, why should it make any difference to your spiritual being or life to have some water sprinkled on you, or to be dunked in other traditions and have words said over you? That changes you. So there's always been a physicality to religious experience. And this just, the fact that we have identified physiologically where this connection can be found, doesn't make the spiritual any less spiritual, not as I see it. It just means that our brains are capable of doing much more than simply handle material objects, material circumstances. As a matter of fact, our brains are capable of transcendence.
Now, through all the mystics you've studied and have read about, has there been any mystics that have exhibited both healthy and unhealthy aspects to their mysticism?
Yes, there are quite a few. Catherine of Siena, at first, when she was fasting and locking herself up like a hermit in her house, her family was immensely concerned. This was not normal behavior. But she came out of that, and like Teresa of Avila, became immensely active and an important leader, not just in the city of Siena, but the Catholic Church as a whole. But there are plenty of cases of individuals who claimed to be having mystical experiences who were not embraced by their communities as mystics, but rather as insane. And some of these individuals, right on that fuzzy line between mysticism and madness. And one of the most amazing of these is a woman named Margery Kempe, an English woman who lived in the late 14th and early to mid 15th century. So a long time ago. But the deal with Margery Kempe was that she was not a nun. She actually came from a well-to-do family, and she was married. She claimed to have had 14 children, and she also, for a while, opened a brewery. Her brewery failed, and then she tried to start a mill, and that failed too. But she started having religious experiences after being ill, just like Julian of Norwich, who, by the way, she ended up going to visit Julian of Norwich, spent several days talking to her through the window of her hermitage. But Margery had many visions and encounters with Christ, the Virgin Mary, with angels, sometimes other saints. And because she was not a nun, she was out in the world. And there was one aspect of her mystical raptures that was very unique, which is that she cried constantly. And when I say she cried constantly, I mean she would go into a church and all of a sudden she would start howling practically. And it could go on for seemingly forever. And she'd be making so much noise that she disturbed everybody everywhere she went. There is this technical term in the study of Catholic mysticism for, quote unquote, the gift of tears, which many saints had. St. Ignatius Loyola had the gift of tears. I mean, frequent weeping, but not constant, disturbing weeping like Margery Kempe. Let me read to you here, because actually, what do we know about Margery Kempe? We know she dictated her autobiography, to a priest who wrote it all down. And this book was lost for centuries. It was finally found in the 1930s. And it's amazing, the story it tells. Here's a passage from the book of Margery Kempe. She had such great compassion and such great pain to see our Lord's pain that she could not keep herself from crying and roaring, though she should have died from it. And this was the first crying that she ever cried in any contemplation. It's a description of her first crying fit. The crying was so loud, this narrative continues, and so amazing that it astounded people. And she had them so often that they made her very weak in her bodily strength, and especially if she heard of our Lord's passion. She decides to go on a series of pilgrimages, one to the Holy Land, one to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, and the other to Rome. And there are a lot of pages in the book of Margery Kempe that deal with the way in which she annoyed her fellow pilgrims that she traveled with so much. They couldn't stand her constant crying and weeping. It would get her into trouble in some places. At one point, she's accused of being a heretic or being a fraud in another place. But this constant howling and crying and weeping definitely placed her in a suspicious category, right between madness and genuine religiosity. And it could be a problem for her. She had very detailed visions as they're described in this book and conversations with Christ. But here's someone, and actually I used this book in class this past week in one of my courses. And more than one student remarked that if she were alive today, she would certainly have been taken directly to a psychiatrist or perhaps committed to an institution for this behavior. So if you're not a nun in a convent, it's even harder to make claims about mystical experiences. So many thought in her own day that all this crying was just a way of getting attention, that she wasn't the genuine article. But actually, if you read descriptions that she has of her mystical experiences, many of them are remarkably similar to experiences of other Christian mystics, some of whom it's quite obvious she read or had read to her because she was illiterate. That somebody read her, for instance, Richard Rolla's Fire of Love, as she describes having experiences like his. Her talk with Julian of Norwich, she says things that are, straight out of Julian of Norwich's book, The Showings, which I'm sure came up in conversation, such as visions of Jesus where he shows up and says, if I could suffer more for you, I would. Straight out of Julian of Norwich. And her life became very complicated because, she had 14 children and a husband, and she decided to take a vow of celibacy. And she did, and she forced her husband to take a vow of celibacy too. But not one of her children, except one. She mentions one son in this book, very briefly. Nothing about the other 13. It's like the children didn't exist, at least for telling this part of the story. So you can see, you can add another element there that, in our day and age might be identified as some form of mental illness. Poor children, abandoned by their mom because she's having all these, quote unquote, as people might see it, hallucinations, and can't stop herself from crying and howling.
I think it should be said that mysticism comes to a person because God wants them to have that experience. God is reaching out to them. And I have to believe that you can have people that have some type of mental illness, that have a devotion to God, that have that connection, that have cultivated that connection with God, that are able to also have a mystical experience. But that doesn't necessarily mean that their mental illness is cured. So you can have someone who has mental issues, but is also very devoted to God, and maybe their mental issues have pushed them to God, just like it's a trial, just like being poor or being handicapped or having an illness. that can lead you to God, that mental illness, be it depression or bipolar disorder or something of that nature, the suffering from that can lead a person to God, to the devotion necessary to be able to have a mystical experience. So there could be an instance where you can have both, where you have genuine mystical experiences and someone who has a genuine mental illness.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. And, there are many mystics who have described their roller coaster ride, which in some cases involves descriptions of periods of intense mental suffering that sound a lot like depression, and they go in and out of these phases. There are descriptions of individuals who all of a sudden they lose their mystical encounters with God. Actually, Margery Kempe goes through a few of these periods where God's not near her or communicating with her. And then when Christ appears, he says, yeah, well, I'm doing this on purpose so that you realize that none of the stuff that you have been experiencing is due to you. This is strictly comes from me. But yes, people who suffer from depression and other forms of mental illness can also be mystics. The two are not mutually exclusive. As a matter of fact, there's a fairly new book I started reading by Richard Saville-Smith. And the title of the book is Acute Religious Experiences. Subtitle is Madness, Psychosis, and Religious Studies. I'm laughing because that subtitle is really supercharged with meaning. What Richard Saville-Smith argues in this book is this term, acute religious experiences, is that there are religious experiences that are above and beyond norm, and that some of them can be experienced by mad people, people with mental illness. And the final argument he makes in his book is that, okay, let me back it up one or two steps. Nowadays, ever since the late 19th century, the medical profession and those who study human emotions and human psychology in the medical profession are all taught to regard religious experiences as being on the spectrum of madness and delusion. And much like William James, they say, well, if this doesn't get in the way of their daily life, right, or their success in life, then it's fine, it's tolerable. Yes, they're all deluded and they have some kind of maybe mild madness, or in some cases, more extreme. So pathologizing is the norm in the medical profession for anybody who has these experiences. Well, Mr. Saville-Smith has this to say: the pathologizing bias of the terminology of mental disorder, even in genetic arguments, requires resistance, correction, and reconsideration. And then he's trying to coin this term madness studies, that he's, of course, what's your expertise, Mr. Saville-Smith? No, I work in madness studies, because he himself was diagnosed with mental illness. So he's been through it and he knows. Here's what he has to say. In mad studies lies the opportunity for the voices of madness to take their place, neither as subject nor object, but as colleagues in the contemporary academy, subject to funding. Yes, this is a legitimate subject, he's saying. But one more quote from him. Being mad is, for me, not the aberration. It is the more William James spoke about, people who experience the more. The numinous, the shamanic consciousness, the mystical experience, the reality beyond the model offered by the psychotomimetic psychedelic experience. Madness is the peak experience. In quantitative terms, madness is a small part of my life. In qualitative terms, it is the most profound, the most important, the most eye-opening, mind-altering, liberating experience, like a light bulb moment, which can last for pain-filled weeks, too hot, too bright, too harsh. I am not me when I am mad. I am the same person, living the same life, but with the costs and benefits of riding a wave of immediacy over which the only control I seek is to go higher. Pretty strong words.
Speaking of this bias that he mentions, I start thinking about how many people have had mystical experiences, and I'm not necessarily referring to mystical experiences with God or with Jesus or with angels or the Virgin Mary, mystical experiences with the demonic, that this bias has pretty much chalks it up to some type of mental illness. You got paranoid schizophrenia. You're not being tormented by demons. That's just your mind playing tricks on you. Let's pump you up with medication and solve the problem, which obviously the medication is not going to solve a demonic problem. It could only mask it. But I cannot imagine that there has not been a large amount of people who have suffered demonic oppression and demonic obsession that have been misdiagnosed as having some type of mental illness and did not receive what they needed was spiritual treatment, not medical treatment.
Absolutely. And there are many. I mean, in Mr. Savile Smith's book, he lists all of the different medical terminology that is used to deal with possession as a pathology. So, it's there, and it's true. Anyone hears voices, especially voices that are telling them to do something that is just not very good, well, the devil is an illness. And here our listeners might appreciate this also from Savile Smith's book. He lists 7 responses that the medical profession has to acute religious experiences. The first is psychosis, the most obvious one. The second is you can be diagnosed as having a dissociative identity disorder, and this is the category that applies to demonic possessions or spirit possessions of any kind. So if you are not in these 2 other categories, psychosis or dissociative identity disorder, another approach is that it's fiction. You're just inventing things, things that never happened. You're just a fraud. The fourth one is that it's a myth, that, you come up with this very, very detailed description of your experiences that turn into a myth, and then other people believe you and they think it's real. But then the 5th possibility, which most physicians will not take, is that it's a fact. Again, one of William James's wild facts. It's a fact that, for instance, when Moses at Sinai received the 10 Commandments, the bush actually burned and God actually spoke. That one is usually tossed out the window. But was Moses mad? Because he saw visions and heard voices. So even if it was a fact that Moses saw the bush burning and heard God's voice, well, of course, you're back to where we started. 6th interpretation of this fact, this wild fact, it's madness. Madness of some kind, not diagnosable after so many thousand years. And then he proposes that his term, acute religious experience, is the best way to diagnose people. That the term itself will make a difference in the way in which these people are viewed and treated. That it's another level of consciousness. It's a tough book to read, but there's some good insights there about the connections between what we call madness and acute religious experiences.
Well, I'm glad we got to do this episode because, as you know, we look at the emails that have been coming in to the show now for over a year and a half. We're almost coming up on our second year here. And a lot of these questions that we get, and we try to answer most of them, are related to these external reasons for mysticism, trying to explain how this mysticism happens. Is it really from God, or is it some type of mental illness? Is it a drug? Is it a trauma? So I hope we gave our listeners some insight into how this whole aspect of the brain and the human brain and how it functions and its connection to mysticism. So for our next episode, what do you have for us?
Well, I thought that we have been touching on a certain subject repeatedly, but haven't investigated it on its own. And I would like to dig deeper into the sources of Christian mystical experience, especially the biblical sources. What is it in the Bible, both the Old and New Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, the Christian scriptures? What is it in there that has fed the Christian mystical tradition? There are many causes for Christian mystical experiences, but the most intense, I think, are those biblical passages that they lay the basic rules as to why this is possible and how it is possible.
I'm looking forward to that. And it's true. What you said, we've touched on that point practically in every single episode. The Bible is the source. The Word of God is the source. So it would be good to see how that intersects with, or how that inspires mysticism.
Yeah, and it might be necessary to divide it up to the sources from the Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, and the Christian New Testament, because there's so much in there. There is just so much. And I've been teaching this subject for so many years. I'm always astounded at how so much just circles back to the Bible. In particular, in the Hebrew scriptures, you've got the Psalms, which are full of mystical poems and songs. And in the New Testament, you've got the Gospels, especially the Gospel of John. So that's what I think we'll be focusing on next time.
Well, I think the Bible provides a perfect breaking point. We can do an episode on the Old Testament and then do an episode on the New Testament and bring them all together. Thanks, Carlos. I appreciate your time, and we look forward to the next episode and our next time together. And to all our listeners, thank you for your support, for your emails. We really do appreciate it. We're glad that you're enjoying the show. And until the next time, thank you for listening to the Christian Mysticism Podcast. If you have any questions for Dr. Eyre, you'll find our email address in the show notes. Just send it over and we'll try to answer it in a future episode. And don't forget to click the subscribe button so you don't miss the next episode of the Christian Mysticism Podcast.